Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. There's an old saying that goes, "Don't pee on my leg and tell me it's raining." I'm sorry to be so crass, but it speaks to the situation at hand. It's exactly what's going on with the Biden administration and immigration. They had the audacity to recently produce a fact sheet called the Biden Administration Blueprint for a Fair, Orderly, and Humane Immigration System. In reading it over, it's a total lie, but it's told by the overlords, so I guess for most people in America, it must be true. They go on to tell us in this document that the Biden administration has made what they're calling considerable progress to build, and get this, a fair, orderly, and humane immigration system. And they continue by saying they're calling on Congress to make long overdue reforms to U.S. immigration laws. Well, the U.S. immigration laws as they are on the book, and if they were enforced, would be just fine, more than sufficient. So that's a red herring. Let's look at the terminology. The first word is fair. Is it fair to put gate crashers to the front of the line? Why would we reward people who have broken the law to the detriment of people who have followed the law? The next word they use is orderly. Anyone who's taken a look at what's going on at the former southern border of the United States of America sees nothing orderly, nothing but chaos. Traffickers are controlling the border and the flow of illegal aliens, and humans are being pressed into sex slavery and drug trafficking. Humane? Have you seen the recent footage or heard the recent reports, and the administration has done a lot to keep this a secret, of atrocious conditions at the southern border in some of these holding cells, and they went after Donald Trump for the conditions under which he was holding people? This is simply being ignored by the mainstream media and by most people in America who were critical previously of President Trump. And then, of course, there's COVID-positive illegal aliens being distributed across the country into unsuspecting communities, governors not being given the heads up, and certainly localities having to deal with the brunt of all of this illness being brought into their own communities. We have very simple expectations as citizens of the United States of America, and primarily that the federal government will do its job to defend our rights and to defend the rule of law in the nation. First off, we should start by defending the sovereignty of the country by controlling the border. No nation can exist that does not control its borders. That has been proven throughout history. Protecting citizens from foreign invasion. It's exactly what's going on right now, and we are not being protected. The country is being invaded across the southern border by people coming from all over the world for various purposes, some of them self-serving and others perhaps nefarious toward the future of the United States of America. And of course, we ought to be looking out for the interests of America first. And yet that phrase is now equivalent to a four-letter word. Is it too much to ask that the federal government would do its job? Apparently so, because the Biden administration refuses. Biden-Harris can pee on my leg and tell me it's raining, but I won't believe it. Their actions speak louder than words, and their actions belie their intentions to completely undermine the rule of law and our present immigration system. I shudder to think of what they want to replace it with, but I can tell you it won't be good for America, and it won't be good for the average American citizen. It's ollie ollie oxen, free, free, free at the former southern border of the United States of America, and no words and no document from the Biden administration can convince me otherwise. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues in a moment.
Associated Press award-winning journalist Rob Schilling.
BorderHawk.News is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration nationalism and globalism. The BorderHawk staff daily curates immigration news stories and, in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. BorderHawk.News highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. BorderHawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border, as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. BorderHawk.News will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark BorderHawk.News. Add them on social media at BorderHawkNews on Twitter.
Looking out for us. Rob Schaub.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues, and we welcome Ken Oliver, Senior Director of Right on Immigration at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And today's topic is Biden's blueprint for a fair, orderly, and humane immigration system. Hey, Ken, welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed.
Thank you, Rob. It's great to be with you.
All right, let's let Biden's immigration actions thus far speak for what he truly believes. So what have you observed in the first 6 months or so of the Biden administration?
Well, Rob, it's been a disaster, really a blueprint for disaster is what we've seen since the beginning of the administration in January. Especially in Texas, where I work for the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We've been to the border 5 times so far this year. And as everyone knows, it's the epicenter of the crisis. What's basically happened is the Biden administration unleashed by rescinding so many of the Trump policies, specifically the migrant protection protocols, to have people wait in Mexico for their asylum claims, which is really what shut down the 2019 crisis. Just 2 years ago, we had a very similar situation, and the Trump administration really struggled with it, frankly, to get it under control. But by reversing all the policies all at once and just really unleashing a flow which continues unabated, and it's been complicated, coronavirus right now, because it's just become a public health crisis as well.
Tell us what it's like on the ground in Texas. We're here in Virginia, so we don't have quite the same experience as you do, but what is it like day to day dealing with this issue?
Well, you have, Democrat mayors and congressmen down there in South Texas up in arms really about the administration having daily super spreader events. We see this on a daily basis in Del Rio and McAllen, and across the border. 2/3 of the U.S. border practically is Texas in our border with Mexico. So what we're seeing, even Mayor Pete Saenz of Laredo is very concerned because the latest numbers he had were 40% COVID positive. These are countries, specifically Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, with 10% or less of the people vaccinated. And, of course, most of those vaccinated would be the older people, not making that trek north. And people just in camps, there's a quarantine camp that has just been set up in Mission, Texas. They're really struggling with nonsensical policy of not applying the Title 42 public health emergency law to the current situation. Now more than ever, there is a justification on a public health basis for not admitting migrants that carry a public health risk.
Do we know what percentage is being tested, and do you have any confirmation of the reports that they are taking people who are infected and just sending them across the country?
Yes, Sister Norma Pimentel of the Catholic Charities Mission in McAllen has confirmed that. Catholic Charities has been testing. The Border Patrol says they can't test everyone right away. They have so many people they're trying to process in McAllen, for example, which is one of the big hotspots. We know that it's been a very difficult situation because the Border Patrol is giving people notices to appear in 60 days at an immigration court and people are being bussed out and shipped out all over the country. And the flights I've taken from South Texas in the recent months, every flight we've had unaccompanied minors on the plane. People are staying at hotels, for example, in La Jolla, where unaccompanied minors and family units principally are being held temporarily, many with COVID, and other guests don't know it. So it's a serious problem.
Ken Oliver, let's look first, before we look at the plan, at the premise the plan is based on. And I thought the first one was laughable if it wasn't so frightening and being disconnected. Biden's claim is that they want an orderly, secure, and well-managed border. I've seen the opposite of all of those.
True. It's so incredible. It's the exact opposite of orderly, humane, exact opposite of compassionate. We need to be compassionate with our own people in the United States, our residents first and foremost. And this is the exact opposite of that. Plus, Rob, the fact is that human smuggling networks, organized crime in Mexico and Central America are benefiting from this policy of letting family units and so many, just a breakdown in our ability to control, because our frontline officers, the federal officers of the Customs and Border Protection and Border Patrol, are being forced to do so much of the processing and babysitting, and they're not able to actually monitor the border. We've been to Del Rio, for example, in the earlier this summer, Del Rio, where people from dozens and dozens of countries are coming through. And there's so many coming in that the Border Patrol is no longer in certain areas where they used to monitor. So we just saw yesterday record heist of fentanyl and meth, for example. It's become a perfect storm.
But this is utter hypocrisy, Ken, because they're claiming that they want to cut all of these drugs off, that we have all these addiction problems, which is true across America. And yet the vast majority of these drugs that are causing us the problems are coming across the border. They seem to be making almost no effort to even acknowledge that, much less address it.
Yes, it's really been a combination of the drug trafficking, human trafficking, really incentivizing this flow of people. And the worst single driver is not to acknowledge the fact, Rob, that most of these people that are claiming asylum do not have legitimate, valid asylum claims. Most claims made by Central Americans, maybe upwards of 80-90%, are found eventually to not be valid. And yet the Biden administration is allowing these invalid claims to be made and not turning off that spigot, because it's just month after month, as we just saw today with the numbers being released, over 210,000 apprehensions at the border. And that doesn't count the number of gotaways, which are also increasing by the tens of thousands where they don't actually apprehend. And the gotaways are even of greater concern, because that's typically single young men who are simply absconding into the country.
Part of the plan, Ken Oliver, does deal with asylum and what they're calling orderly and fair processing of asylum applications. So I think it's helpful for people to understand historically what asylum has been and how the Biden administration wants to broaden the definition.
Sure. Asylum is certainly, and we grant, tens of thousands of asylum claims every year. We don't grant hundreds of thousands or a million claims as we have right now before our immigration courts. Asylum is principally, it was built for people who are political dissidents, religious dissidents, or ethnic minorities, and they're being officially persecuted by their governments of their home countries. It's not for domestic abuse or for gang violence, criminal violence. And this blueprint, which the Biden administration announced 2 weeks ago, their immigration blueprint, talks about expanding access to asylum based on gang violence and domestic abuse. And this is not what, under international treaty, asylum was established to provide protection for. This current administration in Washington is simply facilitating even greater abuse of the asylum system, which the cartels and human smugglers know is the easiest loophole to circumvent our legal immigration process, by simply making these claims that are not valid. And unfortunately, The Biden administration has shown no signs of political will to stop that problem, and on the contrary, it's only getting worse.
So it sounds like they are gaming the system. They're wise to the language. And I think a lot of people, again, don't understand that there's an organized effort here. So is the word out, if you just use the language of asylum, that you'll have an entry pass to the United States?
Yes, there's coaching being done, and people saying they have a fear of returning to their home country, which triggers that claim, fear of persecution. It's dangerous back home. If I go back home, I'll be subject to violence. This is really, we're going to have to see whether the Biden administration finally turns that around and speeds up the deportation process for people with invalid claims. The problem, Rob, is that the Biden administration is on record as saying they will not separate adults from children. And so basically, once people are in the country, even with an invalid asylum claim, we're probably not going to see any deportations of people because they are on record as saying they will not turn back people who have dependents, and that would be the minors. And the Biden administration, beginning on day one, opened the floodgates to every minor. Most minors that are coming in are in the upper teen category, 15, 16, 17. You have an area, for example, I can speak about El Paso, Texas, where we have at Fort Bliss a center for the unaccompanied minors. And the minors themselves, there's serious mental health problems, abuse problems, bullying. The minors have even called this city a COVID city because it's a tent type city. So it's bad news all around. It's not working, and it needs to change.
It sounds like the problems those seeking asylum are fleeing from, they're actually bringing those problems in a higher grade to our own communities. Has that question been asked or addressed, or is it just simply ignored?
I think that question is being ignored. We have serious problems as a result of events in our own country this past year, a terrible situation of the pandemic affecting children, for example. And just as we're trying to get schools up and operating again, to have thousands of minors, hundreds of thousands, coming into the schools because we're obligated to provide public education. This is just another problem that's going to have a terrible impact on communities throughout the country.
I'm curious also because there was a reference to maximizing legal representation. I'm guessing the American taxpayer is paying for all of this.
Yes, the Biden administration is committed to U.S. taxpayer-funded representation and providing this legal representation for an increasing number of people. Unfortunately, very fiscally irresponsible. That's a fairly small amount in the millions or tens of millions, but it all adds up, and the budgets are being busted at HHS, at DHS. Money, in fact, that should be going to pressing needs that we have for current residents of the United States.
There was a line about bolstering public messaging on migration by ensuring consistent messages to what they call discourage irregular migration. Now, this is an interesting term, irregular migration, and I get a feeling that they have a certain meaning behind that. But what about the public messaging? It seems to me they've been encouraging people to flood into the country.
Well, Rob, actually, they've said the right things many times. President Biden and Vice President Harris have said, do not come. But their actions speak louder than words. And so the messaging is not working at all. People are getting the message through the networks and family. The people are coming with their phones and everything and telling people back home, I got in, this works. So it's just snowballing. That's why month after month, the numbers keep going up of people overwhelming our border facilities and border ports of entry. The messaging sometimes sounds that they're being tough, but the reality is that so many family units are being let in. And just this week, there are Biden administration officials in Mexico. I think there are talks going on to try to have the countries south of our border work more to divert the flow, because it is getting overwhelming. Even Panama is complaining because many migrants from all over the world I just saw a report, 30 different countries with tens of thousands of people coming from Colombia into Panama to begin that trek of over 1,500 miles. These countries, these transit countries, are also becoming concerned, and they need to do their part to stop the flow.
It seems to me, Ken Oliver, that if people were poor, maybe in ill health, they would have a difficult time making a 1,500-mile trek. Can you tell us about the conditions of these trains that are coming forward, trains of people? Is somebody paying for this? I don't understand how they can survive walking through arid regions with no money, no food, and poor health.
This is what gives rise to the human trafficking as well, because people pay thousands of dollars to be smuggled and transported, and they end up going into debt. And they're very vulnerable to becoming enslaved practically for once they arrive in the United States, if they do arrive. And the fact is that these summer months, we're seeing increasing numbers of deaths. Hundreds of deaths have occurred already. And this was, again, President Biden had said that this was a seasonal phenomenon, that the numbers would go down as we hit the summer months, which they traditionally do go down, but it's been the exact opposite. So we're in the middle of August now. We're going to see tremendous suffering and deaths. There's a definite responsibility by the current administration for this tragedy.
There is a plank of the plan that talks about making better use of existing enforcement resources. And according to the previous points in our conversation, Ken, you had mentioned that many of these agents are being reduced to babysitters. So I guess I agree with this one, but they've placed us in this position, the Biden administration has.
Even under the Trump administration, most deportations were criminal people that ran into trouble with the law, had a run-in and were in the local or county jail. And so there was this cooperation to get public safety threats. By definition, if you're in the jail, you've been determined to be a threat. So this is really part of the perfect storm, Rob, is that the interior enforcement has collapsed. And although the Biden administration says they want to prioritize public safety threats, the reality is that deportations have gone way down. They should be way up based on the numbers of people coming in without lawful ability to come in. And yet we've seen deportations and arrests go way down by ICE. They talk about enforcement priorities, but they're not following those priorities. If they were following the priorities, they would be arresting and deporting recent arrivals who are coming in unlawfully, and we're not seeing that.
What about the partnerships, the regional partnerships? I know that the Trump administration worked hard to get agreements with these various nations, and it was kind of a carrot and stick approach. But what about the Biden administration when they talk about providing humanitarian support to keep people home? Is that what we ought to be doing?
Well, there's certainly a place for humanitarian support, but we and President Trump actually, possibly a strong suit of his was what he did in terms of using that carrot and stick approach. When things were getting so out of control under his administration that he finally told people in his counterparts in Central America and Mexico, look, we're going to put in tariffs on Mexican products if you don't cooperate on the migrant protection protocols. We're going to reduce the humanitarian aid that's hundreds of millions a year if you don't work with us to stop the flow. This is the exact opposite of what's happening under the Biden administration. Now, there are some indications that the Biden administration is finally beginning to work with Mexico, but it's very little, and we don't see the effects yet. It doesn't make any sense to be increasing aid with countries that are not being helpful right now. And we have Mexican states right across from our border in Texas that have refused to accept minors, unaccompanied minors and family units back into Mexico from where they've come. So our Border Patrol has had to fly people to other parts of the U.S. border with Mexico, or fly and work with Mexico to fly them into the interior of the country, which is what's happening now. So there's a tremendous expense that the U.S. taxpayers are incurring, both for these process of migrant the shelters and the facilities for unaccompanied minors, plus the expenses just of the lawlessness.
They want to invest, quote unquote, in Central America to what they're calling address the root causes of migration. It seems to me that we ought to be investing in the United States of America first and foremost, but they're talking about combating corruption and strengthening democratic governance. It just seems like a problem that we're not equipped to solve. I mean, we can't fix the internal corruption and governance problems of other nations. I think we've learned that over the years.
We should have learned that lesson. We only control our own country's policies, and it's difficult enough to control our own conditions with rising crime throughout major cities throughout the country, with the wrench that the pandemic threw into our economy that's only really recovering on and off in many sectors, and many sectors still way below where they should be. It's been just the worst possible time for us to be facing the kind of crisis we're facing of illegal immigration into the country right now at 20-year record highs.
I found it interesting that they use this phrase in accusing the prior administration of, quote unquote, cruel and reckless policies. Is there any indication that there's truth in that statement, or is this just rhetoric that's being put forward to condemn the previous administration?
I don't think that this is a fair characterization, accurate characterization at all to say that the past administration had cruel and reckless policies. On the contrary, the past administration was fighting the human trafficking, fighting the drug cartels, and this current administration has been empowering and facilitating organized crime and facilitating human smuggling, human trafficking, and people have been dying. Now, people dying that back home, they would probably still be alive, right? People that have been enticed to make these trips and have ended up hundreds. We're talking about hundreds dying just in the last couple months. Their bodies are found, and some, for example, our county sheriffs constantly report that in Texas of finding human remains of migrants. So it's talk about humane, and it's absolutely not humane what's being allowed to happen. Really, we need to have tough love for our neighbors, and tough love means having laws that are respected, having a legal immigration system that's adjusted to our economy, that does recognize that we do need legal immigration, and we do need guest workers at times. We need temporary workers, but we don't need a flood of people coming in that are going to be most vulnerable to human trafficking.
There was another phrase that was used, Ken Oliver, in this Biden blueprint, and I wanted to get your take on this because it really rubbed me the wrong way. It said millions of non-citizens call our country home, and then went on to say they are Americans in every way, but on paper. That seems to be foreshadowing to me a mass amnesty. Right.
Yes. Basically, it's diminishing the importance of American citizenship and being a lawful resident of the United States as the first step of being a U.S. citizen. It's really the word games in the blueprint that Biden announced on his immigration policy a couple weeks ago. There are so many word games and red flags throughout that document. It really is an eye-opener for people because it is a blueprint for the disaster. It's incoherent. There's double standards. In fact, as we pointed out early in the conversation, they only indicate that they're going to facilitate even more asylum claims, which will in turn be invalid because unless they radically change the rules. Right now, they are beginning to change the asylum rules, as they indicate in the blueprint, to allow for asylum being granted based on gang violence and domestic abuse.
Ken Oliver, what are the likely next steps? What should we be looking out for in the months and years ahead?
Well, we're going to see, in all likelihood, this crisis continue. I'm afraid to say that it's going to continue to get worse. There are indications public opinion has shifted against the Biden administration policies, and the administration is getting very low marks, especially beginning where the crisis is starting, which is in the border sectors of South Texas, and where, as I mentioned earlier, even traditionally Democratic areas have shifted. The mayor of McAllen is now Republican. Just a few months ago, the mayor of McAllen was a Democrat. You've had very close races, surprisingly so, and that's probably the political opposition will continue to increase, and that will hopefully prompt a change in policy. And as I indicated, there are indications that this week there are officials in Mexico working to try to stem the flow.
Ken, where can we get more information on your work at Right On Immigration?
We can be seen at texaspolicy.com, and we have a whole section on immigration there.
And Ken Oliver, appreciate your work, and thank you so much for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thank you, Rob. I appreciate the opportunity.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at shillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time,